Welcome back to another episode of Cape Ann Today. I am speaking to our very busy State Senator Bruce Tarr, who is deep in the discussions about the 2024 fiscal budget for the state of Massachusetts in the Senate. So what's going on?
Well, first of all, it's great to see you, Heather, and thanks for letting me share a few thoughts today with you. This is one of the busiest times of every year at the State House, where we are preparing to debate in the Senate the fiscal year 2024 state budget. And that's important, not only because it's going to spend about $56 billion of taxpayer funds, but it's also important because the budget is a vehicle that folks use not only to advance spending, but also policy, because it's the one thing that you know needs to pass in any given year, because we need to have a state budget, and we should have it in place by the beginning of the new fiscal year, which is July 1. Sometimes we don't meet that deadline, but something that I always try to emphasize is that unlike with the federal government, you very rarely, if ever, hear any talk in Massachusetts of state government shutting down over the inability to pass a budget. And that's because we usually agree to do an interim budget, which is a bridge between whenever the point we're at and the point that we can finally get the budget passed. And those usually last for a week or two, sometimes a month or two. But you don't hear any discussion on Beacon Hill about the fact that we're not going to be able to reach agreement on the budget and everything's going to stop, because it's not. And so we're working right now on the Senate version of the budget. The House passed its version in April, and we have a lot of amendments. We have about 1,050 amendments that have been filed. About 75 of those were mine. And members file all manner of amendments, whether it's on public policy or a particular spending item. But again, the budget becomes a vehicle that everyone looks to because they know it's going to move. It's not like any other bill where there's uncertainty about whether or not it's going to pass, or there's a necessity of passing it. And so when we look at this particular budget, it comes at a very interesting time, because we've been doing pretty well with regard to revenue in fiscal year 23. And in fact, up until April, and taking into account a lot of different factors, we were still about $73 million ahead of the benchmark upon which the budget is based. But April tax numbers were very concerning. And so we saw a major decline in revenue of somewhere between $1.5 billion and $2 billion. And so folks would logically say, well, what does that do to this budget proposal? If you're looking at that kind of a downtrend, can you realistically come up with a solid figure to base next year's budget on? And the answer is yes. And that's because we do have a consensus revenue estimate that have been agreed to by the House and the Senate and the administration. And that's what the governor used to prepare her budget. It's what the House used to prepare its budget. And that's what we're using in the Senate Ways and Means Committee. And part of the reason we can do that is that 2/3 of that downturn in April was from capital gains taxes. And the other third, roughly speaking, was from the use by some business entities of so-called pass-through entity tax credits. And that was something we did when the federal tax code changed, and we wanted our businesses in Massachusetts to be able to have a credit against that change, so we would help their viability. So with regard to the capital gains tax, the revenue from that is capped, and above a certain amount, it all goes into the stabilization fund. So it wouldn't be available for spending anyway. And so because that was 2/3 of what trended down, it doesn't have that much impact on the budget. When it comes to the pass-through tax entity credit, we had stocked away a little bit of a reserve for that, knowing that at some point those credits will be used. And so we are not as impacted by this as you might think if you just read the headline that our tax numbers went down by that much. So we're pushing forward. Doesn't mean that we're not thinking about the future and thinking about what those numbers mean, but it does mean we can move forward with a fairly comfortable level with regard to the amount of revenue we're going to have to spend, which means that we have some additional dollars. This budget is about a 1.6% increase over last year. And there's some really interesting things here, Heather. One of them is that there's $100 million in the Senate Ways and Means budget proposal for school construction projects that have experienced cost overruns due to inflation and supply chain issues. So when you think about that, East Veterans Elementary School in Gloucester fits that category. So that extra $100 million, some of it could benefit East Veterans Elementary School. In addition, there's another $100 million baked into the budget for additional money for roads and bridges. Now, we've talked before about Chapter 90, and usually we give our municipalities about $200 million a year for roads and bridges. There's an extra $100 million baked into this budget on top of that, and that's reflective of the fact that we have a little bit of flexibility. We have some dollars to be able to spend. And then there are the usual accounts that you and I usually talk about. So Chapter 70, which is the main way that the state supports K through 12 education, is getting a $603.6 million increase. Now that sounds like a lot, but remember, it goes through a formula, and sometimes that formula doesn't deliver the results for local school districts that we would hope, but it's still an increase. In addition to that, unrestricted general government aid, which is the dollars that cities and towns get from state government to use for just about any purpose, that is going up by almost $40 million. So there's some good news here on a number of different fronts. One of the other things that I'll mention before I stop and take a breath is that we are very concerned in the Senate, and our budget reflects this, with the need to have more worker training and a pipeline, particularly for nurses and folks in the healthcare professions. So there's a significant emphasis in this budget on training and education and certification for nurses and folks in the healthcare field. So a lot of things happening in this budget. And actually, as we speak right now, we're talking on Monday around noontime. We're going to start debate on this budget in just a couple of hours at 3 p.m. on Monday.
And how long do you anticipate this debate will be?
Well, it will go at least through Thursday. It may end early on Thursday, but it will go at least through Thursday, and it will depend on how much debate there is. With over 1,000 amendments, it can take a while. But my prediction, and it's always risky to make one, is that we will probably conclude debate on Thursday.
So it sounds as if the healthcare training, emphasis on that, is a policy issue. And you were being very clear in the beginning of your conversation that policy ends up being a part of this budget because it can. So do you want to introduce a couple of other policy issues that will be up for debate?
So I absolutely can. One of the other things that we've been very interested in the Senate, and actually this has been informed significantly by a working group the Cape Ann Chamber of Commerce put together on social emotional learning in our schools and mental health in our schools. And so in this budget, there is once again a grant program, and there are other initiatives around mental health, which is a very important issue that for too many years got overlooked. And so there's mental health policy, and there are mental health dollars in this budget. There's also the subject of telehealth, which is something that proved itself invaluable during the pandemic. And there's a policy question that's going to be discussed in this budget. It's not finally decided yet. And it has to do with the reimbursement rates for telehealth. So currently the reimbursement rates are roughly equivalent for a telehealth visit with an office visit at a provider's office. And there's a question about whether or not we should extend that parity of reimbursement, or whether a telehealth visit should be reimbursed at a lower level. So that will be discussed in the budget. And then one of the other major policy issues in the budget is the notion of making community college free. And so Governor Healy had proposed something called the Reconnect program, which would affect those over 25 years old, and trying to help them get back to community college and be able to build their career and advance their career by getting that community college education. Senate President Spilka has made it a priority for students generally to be able to access free community college. And so both of those ideas are going to be discussed in this budget debate, and whether or not it's one, the other, or a continuum. But what is clear is that if we're going to make community college free, there's a lot of planning that has to go into that. We can't just say to the community colleges, okay, tomorrow you're going to have this huge influx of students. So there is money in the budget, and this is fairly definite, to plan for whatever we decide, whether it be the folks over 25, the students, both. And that will be a major policy discussion that will be contained in this budget. One thing that is not contained in this budget, and that is the tax relief package that has been so elusive for us to get passed. And so the House included it in a separate bill that they did before they debated the budget. We are likely going to debate that tax package after we're concluded with our budget debate. But folks will be hearing plenty from me about the need to do that and to not pass a budget without giving any thought or any acknowledgement to the fact that folks need and deserve tax relief. So that'll be a policy debate that we'll have as well.
So, but what you're saying is that this budget will not include any tax relief policy, but maybe later.
And it's the maybe later that's a particular concern to me, because we've been told by the Ways and Means Committee chair and others that they're accounting for almost $600 million to be used in a tax relief package. But when you read through the pages of the budget, you don't see that. So I have an amendment to put that amount into a reserve account so it's there, and we know it's there, and we can point to it and say, after this debate is done, we made a solid provision for those tax relief items to be debated and passed after we're done with this debate. But that's going to be a major policy discussion that's going to start in just a few hours.
Well, you just make it so exciting.
Well, it is exciting. And you know, one thing that's exciting about this is the fact that in our Senate, every member has an important role to play. And this isn't a situation where the budget gets handed down from on high and then it gets rubber stamped. That doesn't happen at all. There's over 1,000 amendments. I've offered more than any other senator, but that's because I wear two hats as the leader of the minority party and as the representative in this chamber of 19 communities. But it's an exciting time when we can come together in the Senate chamber and have the kind of debate that has characterized American democracy from its inception, and should. And so, you know, there will be certainly debate among members of the different parties. There'll be different coalitions that'll be supporting one thing or another. And this is the kind of process that we should have to be able to make such important decisions. Now, will there be debate on every amendment? There definitely will not. But there will be debate on amendments that the members choose to prioritize out of the 1,050 that have been filed, and we'll have a good discussion. And that, to me, is very exciting.
I know you've said this before, but tell us where things go from here. So you'll have this debate, and then what happens?
So when we conclude our debate, which I'm pretty confident will be concluded sometime this week, we will have a Senate version of the budget. There is a House version of the budget that was passed back in April, and 3 members of the House and 3 members of the Senate will get together and reconcile those 2 versions. And that can be a very intense process. And it can take a while, which is why sometimes we have to pass an interim budget to get some more time. But when that conference committee report is done between the conference committee, the 3 members of the House and the 3 members of the Senate, trying to see if I can get the 3 fingers up here, when they get that done, then it comes back to the Senate and the House, and you only have one vote on that report. You either accept the whole thing or you reject the whole thing. Assuming it gets accepted, it then goes to the governor, and she has 10 days to look at that conference committee report, and she has a line item veto, which is one of the things that distinguishes us from the federal government. Any item in that budget, she can veto, and then it comes back to us to be considered for override. So we've still got a fair amount of process left to go here,
I would say. So speaking of, well, it's not a conference committee, the Joint Telecommunications, Utilities, and Energy Committee. It's a joint committee, right? So do you want to, we're going to leave the budget. Tell us what's going on with this committee, because it's been in the news.
So most of the committees in the legislature are joint committees, and that means that they have 11 members of the House and 6 members of the Senate. They always have at least 1 member from the minority party. And rather than have, as they do in Washington, a separate House committee on a subject and a separate Senate committee, we don't do that. We have joint committees that consider the subject matter together as a group. And so those 17 members, for instance, in this case, look at telecommunications, utilities, and energy. And I'm actually very pleased to serve on that committee because of my interest in alternative energy and decarbonization and making sure that we have ample supplies of the energy that we need. And so that committee is governed by a House chair and a Senate chair. And the way that our rules work is that the House and the Senate chair need to agree on some things. One of them is the scheduling of hearings. The rules basically dictate that the chairs will agree on that, and then they'll put out a schedule and we'll have hearings accordingly. There has been a conflict that has arisen in terms of the chairs not being able to reach an agreement. And while I have a very definite opinion about this, I'm not going to share it except to say that the House and the Senate chair have not been able to reach an agreement on the rules that will govern the committee beyond what's provided for in the joint rules. They have not been able to reach an agreement on the hearing dates or the substance of the hearings. And there have been some memos that have gone out without the approval of one or the other. And this is deeply concerning because it threatens the way that we have worked for a very long time as a House and Senate joint committee. And so right now, the matter is certainly being discussed by a lot of folks, including me. And we'd like to get back to the point where this joint committee operates smoothly as its cohort does of joint committees in the legislature. But we need to make sure that whatever agreement is reached, it fairly reflects the House and the Senate. It cannot be unilateral. And that's particularly important to senators because we have the minority of members on the committee. So the House has more members than we do. So it's very important to us that the committee's decisions be balanced and that we don't get displaced from the discussion by virtue of the fact that we have fewer members.
So can you sort of say generally how it has evolved to this? And is this symptomatic of a larger issue on Beacon Hill?
These issues have come up in the past, and they usually come up in the context of the adoption of joint rules. And there's two sets of rules in the legislature, well, actually three, but there's one set that each branch adopts, one for the House, one for the Senate. And then there's a set of joint rules where, once again, the Senate proposes its version and the House proposes its version, and then they need to be reconciled. That didn't happen in the last legislative session. And it hasn't happened yet in this legislative session. So we are still operating on carryover rules from 2 sessions ago, because the way the rules work, if you don't adopt ones, generally speaking, you adopt the prior rules, at least until you can get the new ones adopted. So this usually comes up in that context about how are the committees going to operate. One thing that often comes up is the issue of posting votes, for instance, on the internet and for public inspection. I worked with my Senate colleagues to make sure that Senate votes of Senate committees are posted for public inspection. We have repeatedly put that in our version of the joint rules, and it has not been accepted. So these discussions happen, and it probably 7 or 8 years ago, there was a major discussion about whether to split the joint committees and go to a system more like what we see in our nation's capital, where there's a House committee and a Senate committee on each subject. We decided that that wasn't a very efficient way to do things. It would be far better if we could continue to work together. And I believe that now. So this isn't a discussion that hasn't happened before. And it generally has to do at its root as to where bills go when they're approved or rejected by a committee. The Senate would like its bills, when those reports are made, to come to the Senate, and the House bills to go to the House. Oftentimes that hasn't happened, and that's at the root of this dispute.
So how will it get resolved? You don't have to tell me what the answer will be, but where is this going?
I wish I knew the answer to that. There is no roadmap for this particular issue, but I've been in conversations with the Senate chair of the committee. I know others have been talking with the House chair. There is no clear path here, but my hope is that it does get resolved in an amicable way, because I think it can be resolved in an amicable way. And we just need to be able to codify that most precious of things in government, which is agreement by consensus.
And this committee in particular is working a lot on the climate change past 2 years ago, which is a huge package, right?
There were 2 bills on this subject that were passed last year that came through this committee. And in the past, there have been other very significant bills that have come through this committee. relative to climate change and energy supply and decarbonization. So this is a very important committee, and it's a committee that hears legislation that folks have very strong opinions about, as they should. And so, one of the things that Senator Barrett, who is the Senate chair of the committee, has said, and I believe actually Representative Roy, who's the House chair, have both said that this committee is charged with incredibly important topics for our future. And we need to make sure that it operates properly. Unfortunately, there's right now two different opinions of what that means, but I'm hoping that we'll be able to resolve it, and I'm going to do everything I can to play my part in achieving that resolution.
All right. Well, thank you for everything, and good luck with the debate.
Thanks, Heather. I look forward to giving you a report as to what got accomplished and hopefully some more positive news. And really appreciate the chance to be with you and appreciate what 1623 Studios does to allow us to tell you what's happening on Beacon Hill almost on a minute-to-minute basis. So thanks again.
Great. All right. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Interested in a sponsorship? Email sponsor@1623studios.org to learn more.